Welcome to the Natasha Helfer podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
Hello, everybody. I'm Natasha Helfer. This is the Natasha Helfer podcast, and we are here to try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, and relationships. What I've decided I'm going to do about once a month is invite my providers from Symmetry Solutions to panel discussion about whatever's happening kind of currently in the news. There's always things that are happening in the intersection of religion, faith, mental health, culture, all kinds of things. So we're excited to kind of give some feedback on some of our ideas about some of the current issues that they're happening. So with me today, I have Jenny Elledge from Orlando, Florida. I have Michelle Peets from Salt Lake City, Utah, and Stephanie Lobrot also from Salt Lake City, Utah. So welcome, everybody. Nice to have you here.
Hi.
Super glad to have you. So, all right, first topic of discussion is a big one that I'm seeing kind of definitely right now here in Utah, but it's happening kind of all over the United States. So there's quite a few things that are happening legislatively where there are attempts to ban, different types of transgender care for minors, for adolescents that are under the age of 18. This might include things like puberty blockers, HRT treatments, surgeries, which are not really usually done anyway on minors, but this is kind of the next wave of transphobic kind of issues that is kind of going throughout the country. I know these issues are coming up in states like Texas, some of the southern states, and even other places that sometimes I'm kind of surprised to hear. So this is what we're here to talk about. I thought I would start by reading a bit or most of a letter that was written by Dr. Colleen Kuhn. I hope I'm saying that right. She's a clinical child and adolescent psychologist, and she does a really good job of kind of talking about why we as therapists and mental health clinicians and doctors might be concerned with politicians taking over what might be considered, part of actual medical care. So she says, my name is Dr. Colleen Kuhn. I'm a clinical child and adolescent psychologist who specializes in sexual and gender-related issues of children, adolescents, and young adults. I'm a full member of WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, who, by the way, just recently came out with new guidelines of best standards of care. And I have been a board member of the LGBTQ Affirmative Psychotherapist Guild of Utah, which, by the way, we at Symmetry Solutions are part of that organization as well. I am writing to express my concerns regarding the proposed legislation, specifically here in the state, SB 16 and SB 93. So here's kind of how she explains this. The ability to consent for medical treatment such as puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones has been hotly debated. It's been found that based on clinical assessments and a semi-structured interview, transgender adolescents that were assessed, they were competent to consent to treatment at a rate of 93 to 89%. Moreover, transgender and non-binary youth ages 13 through 17, half of them wanted hormone blockers. Receiving hormone blockers was associated with almost 40% lower odds of recent depression and attempting suicide. Let's think about that, 40%. Similarly, almost 9,000 transgender adults wanted hormone blockers but did not receive them, compared to 12,700 adults who received hormone blockers. Post hoc analysis revealed access to hormone blockers in adolescents was associated with lower odds of suicidal ideation in the last year compared to those who received hormone blockers in adulthood. So this is a huge thing. We'll talk a little bit more about why hormone blockers are important for kids who are dealing with gender dysphoria in regards to their bodies and their kind of puberty and their development. But it's important for people to understand this too. 45% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. That's 53% of transgender and non-binary youth are considering suicide currently in our country. Those rates, I mean, that's like emergency. We are in a national emergency. This is not, these numbers are way beyond what the norm would be for suicidal rates. And 71% of transgender and non-binary youth report that they have experienced discrimination based on their gender identity. That's from the Trevor Project. So we have, the ability to change it. So what is at stake for gender expansive youth who aren't afforded hormone blockers or cross-sex hormones? Their mental health, their risk of suicide, their risk of dying by suicide. Puberty blockers have been used for decades in precocious puberty. They are seen as relatively harmless. Any concerns for bone density are mitigated by following recommendations by nutritionists. So she's addressing some of the concerns that have been brought up. Youth are not on hormone blockers indefinitely. When hormone blockers are desired and it is evaluated as appropriate, youth can start cross-sex hormones. Ask any affirming parent and they will tell you they will gladly accept any risks with hormone blockers and have their child alive, then refuse them this medical intervention and at best have their child hospitalized for a suicide attempt and at worst have their child die. Anecdotally, I can attest to the decrease in suicidality in the gender expansive clients with whom I work with. And then she kind of goes on to talk about, remember kind of just how difficult adolescence is for everybody. And the thing I kind of want to talk about today is just imagine being in a body where your gender is female, but now you're growing, an Adam's apple, or you're growing facial hair, or let's say your gender is male, but you're starting to notice the approach of menses or breastfeeding, and how difficult that would be if you can consider putting yourself in the shoes of an adolescent who is not aligned with their biological sex, right? Who is not identifying with their biological sex. So I'd like to kind of open it up for discussion. What are your thoughts about why we're in the current predicament we're in, where it seems like we made so much progress towards transgender care in the last 20 years? We're kind of definitely taking many steps back. We're having lots of legislators deny access to minors, and not only minors, but the parents who are wanting this kind of care, and also impinging on medical professionals who are doing their best standards of care.
Yeah, there seems to be a trend lately of politicians thinking that they are the experts when it comes to medical care. I think really the only authority they have is to make sure that people have access to medical care, not to prescribe for them what ought to be done. I mean, we're seeing that not just in transgender healthcare, but in all kinds of issues. We just saw that last year with the women's choice to what they want to do with their own reproductive rights. There's a lot of foot stepping going on here. I'm not sure how exactly they thought they had the authority to do these things.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting how people completely out of their scope of practice. I mean, that's something we're taught, right? Is don't practice outside of scope of practice. I'm not allowed to, as a therapist, say, I think this antidepressant might really be a good idea for you, right? That's out of my scope of practice. I am not a physician, right? I'm a mental health talk therapist. So I may have opinions about antidepressants, but that is not in my scope of practice to give suggestions about what type of antidepressant somebody would be on. That would be, terms for losing my license.
Well, and more specifically, like, it's not our job when clients come to us who are gender expansive to tell them, like, yes, you are transgender, you should get surgery, that's so not even our job. And we study this very closely and try to, be quote unquote experts on it. And we still recognize that that's not our place to ever make that call for clients. And so, we're here to kind of be on the journey with them and point them towards resources should they be interested in pursuing their journey in a certain way. But even with us who study it so closely, it's it's not our call.
And as you mentioned, pointing toward resources, being able to find resources and point them toward them. I think in the past, gender diverse, gender expansive individuals have had a difficulty accessing medical care, that we have been slowly progressing towards receiving the medical care that they need, that it's even available. And now we are stepping back to, in terms of providing medical care for this population, we're on a backwards trajectory. That actual medical care in the medical field, this is something that's going to become, if these laws pass, difficult for doctors to practice in the way that they've been trained.
And we're already seeing that with women care. We're already seeing that.
Right. It's interesting that the second bill that I spoke of doesn't even have anything to do with medical care. It's a bill to block changes to birth certificates for anyone under the age of 18. So this isn't even something that affects anybody's, body. It's just being like, no, we're not going to allow you to identify in the way that you want to identify, which goes drastically different from the state of California, which now in California, when a baby is born, the parents have the choice to not put a gender, to allow the gender to emerge for the child, and for that decision to be made, when the child gets to decide what their gender is, which is why, so many people just really don't have a very educated stance on the difference between biological sex assigned at birth and gender, right? So people may have penises, people may have vulvas and vaginas, but that doesn't mean that they feel, feminine or masculine or, non-binary, and all those kind of cultural constructs that are placed more by the environment, and also can have some biological leanings as well, right? So we know that some people who are born with a penis may have a brain that actually is more aligned with kind of a female brain, right? And so there's all kinds of complicated factors, whether they're environmental or biological, as to why gender is not the same as whatever external genitalia you happen to be born with. And this doctor goes on to say that research shows that youth whose chosen name is used is associated with 65% fewer suicide attempts. Just affirming a person's identity, just affirming that, yes, we hear you. We want to honor you. I mean, think about it. Think about you, feeling like whatever you feel like in your gender, and people constantly misnaming you, instead of Alex calling you Alexa, right? Or instead of Brian calling you Barbara, right? And then using pronouns that you don't resonate with. And, people may say, well, what's the big deal about what's on your birth certificate? But this has a huge deal on your documents, on what you're called at school for kids, right? If you're admitted to the hospital, then you've got that band on your wrist for your names. So yeah, this is, it's a lot of increased anxiety for people who can't identify, the way they want to.
That makes sense, right? I'm trying to imagine a scenario of my name is Jenny. If someone was trying to call me Joseph or said he, I would have a very visceral reaction and want to correct that, right? Because that's not who I am. That might be a good exercise for all of us to try that maybe for a day, if we're having a hard time, maybe making a connection as to why this is very important for these individuals.
I think a lot of this comes from fear-based ideas around protecting children, and kind of this parenting paradigm that parents know best. And that, just kind of like a 1950s approach to parenting, that the authoritarian parenting kind of phenomenon, and children are to be seen but not heard, and children are just kind of not really true adults until they reach some magical age. I guess in this country, the magical age is 18, even though we know that brain development is much more complex than that. So, we don't trust children to know themselves. We don't, even the concept of something like puppy love, it's minimizing, right? It's like, oh, this experience that you're having because you happen to be 14 isn't really real, doesn't really matter because you're not 25. And yet the research shows over and over again that people who are adult, who identify as transgender, non-binary, gender expansive, will state very clearly that for most of them, not all, but for most people, they knew from a very early age, even as early as 5, 6 years old, what their gender identity was. These are things that kind of come somewhat early in development. Doesn't mean that you can't have some evolution of gender identity as you grow, but for a lot of people, it is a very early developmental phase.
And I think along with that, the concern I always hear from people who push back against this is, what if they decide they're the other gender and then years down the road they realize that they're not, and that creates all kinds of complications, and that's something that they won't be able to handle and is so destructive, right? It's this feeling of like this is just going to create mass chaos if they're wrong and we supported them in their gender identity development. And I think that's such an odd argument, because identity is an endless conversation for all of us beyond gender. We are constantly trying on new things about who we are. And yes, it's confusing and sometimes it's really scary, right? I think it's also kind of disorienting for the people around us. And yet we do this. Trying to figure out our identity is just a part of the human experience. And we don't seem to push back against it in all these other aspects of our lives where we've normalized it. And so I think looking at something like gender, it just hasn't, I think we haven't spent enough time really thinking about it to get comfortable with the idea of people, exploring what that looks like. And that may be changing from time to time throughout their lives.
Right. There's an anxiety if it isn't decided, and if it isn't decided according to the cultural norms somehow. Right. Yeah, I really appreciate that discussion of it being kind of an evolving thing. That's a lot of what I spoke with Lisa Diamond on in the first episode of this podcast, Rebranding, was the evolution of sexuality, the evolution of identity, that it's not something you just decide one day and then that's the rest of your life. At the same time, with what you're saying, so there have been a few cases where people have had some regret, or some concern about procedures they did while they were younger, whether they were surgical or hormonal, and they have now regret and want to return to a different type of identity. That number is less than 1% of, if I remember correctly, I'd probably have to go look that up, but I believe it's less than 1% of the transgender community who receives medical care. So if you think about any medical procedure, whether you go in for cancer treatment, hip replacements, birth control pills, if you go in for any type of medical treatment, there is a risk. There is a risk of regret. There is a risk of, think about plastic surgery. Why are we not making plastic surgery kind of not something that people can access to? Are you going to regret the surgery you just had for cosmetic reasons, right? Or whatever. But it's so interesting to me that we don't gatekeep other types of risks the way we gatekeep risks for transgender folks, when the people who are gatekeeping those risks are not even transgender themselves, right? And they're not part of the transgender community. And the transgender community is saying, no, this is something we need and want, and is actually better for our health, physical, mental, relational, spiritual, etc. So that's very frustrating. So the risks of not treating are so much higher when you look at those numbers, right? Of suicidal ideation and depression and anxiety and substance abuse. Those numbers, we're talking about 50, 60%, but over here, because of this less than 1% risk, we're going to make decisions that affect a huge amount of the population. And also in a country where it's so interesting to me that, oftentimes it's the religious right movements and these political movements that are all about, shutting these things down. But then the moment that you say, hey, maybe we should have comprehensive sexual education for all children. Oh, no, not my child. I'm the parent. I get to decide what comes into my home and to, teach my children. But now I'm very comfortable telling another parent what they can or cannot do medically with their child. That to me is just so incredibly hypocritical. I just don't even understand that reasoning.
Just to reaffirm what you had said about suicidality, the number of kids, like you said, 54% had identified as transgender and non-binary, have seriously considered suicide, and 29% have actually made an attempt. Those numbers, like you said, if you look at the numbers, how gender affirming care, medical care, brings those numbers down. And if we look at, if you're going to the how many people are regretting that they had gender affirming care, if you could look at the numbers, I don't know what these numbers are, but how many have felt suicidal after receiving gender confirming care, gender affirming care, versus how many have healed from suicidal tendencies or ideation after receiving gender affirming care. It just seems so contradictory in terms of, isn't it the lives that we are trying to save? Isn't it the mental health that we are trying to protect? So yeah, that, I guess that would be my question, is what are we trying to protect people from by banning gender affirming care? Are we protecting them from future regret, or are we protecting them from current mental health crises?
I love that. That's very well said, because again, and even that future regret is so infinitesimal in the numbers. It's just kind of a ludicrous thing. And what they'll do, which is very provocative, to people's kind of heartstrings, and they did this here in Utah as well, is that they'll bring in that one person who regretted it, and they'll share their big story about, how they were damaged by this type of gender affirming care. So they'll find the one kind of poster child for that issue, but then ignore, the 10,000 stories that would be equal to that one story as far as, statistically, as far as how helpful it was for them to have this type of care. So that's another tactic that gets used a lot to kind of scare the public. Okay, moving on. So back in, when was this? Well, I guess it was just recently that it went through. Was it in January that it went through? But we had this bill to protect gay marriage, right? That went through in our country. There's a lot of celebration around that. And, you'd think that I would be celebratory about that. In some ways I am. I guess my concern is that there's a lot behind the support for that bill, especially from religious communities and especially from the Mormon Church, that is problematic. Problematic, because the bill didn't just go through. It had a lot of stuff get thrown into it in order for it to go through, that has to do with the classic argument of religious freedoms, right? So when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints says that it's supporting this bill, it's not by any means saying that it's changing any of its doctrinal ideology or dogma around their discrimination against LGBTQ plus folks. And so it kind of is maddening to me, because on the one hand, it looks like this positive thing that they're doing, when on the other hand, I know that they're making a very strong effort to make sure that any bill like this that passes has these protections for religious freedoms, which means sure, yeah, pass the bill, but we still get to discriminate. We still get to make sure that these people do not get the same rights and privileges in our community, in our businesses and our, ways of managing life. So any thoughts on kind of mixed feelings about the Protect Gay Marriage bill passing from either of you? And Jenny had to leave, by the way. She had a client at the top of the hour, so that's why we're not hearing from her anymore. Any thoughts about your own personal kind of just reactions to when this was going down?
Well, just that when gay marriage existed without strings attached, straight marriage exists without specific strings attached, right? Like in terms of religious community. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think off the top of my head of any strings attached to straight marriage within the religious community. But the fact that this came with those strings attached, and more specifically, if you can, the religious freedom, I don't have it right in front of me, but Natasha, I don't know, are you more familiar with specifically what those strings were? Yes, we will support gay marriage, but there was a but, an if.
Yeah, the buts and ifs have everything to do with kind of these religious freedom language things that get put in, right? And so, which allows, for example, a school like Brigham Young University to still have federal funds allotted to them while they discriminate against LGBTQ plus students, right? So that's kind of where church and state get conflated, right? I mean, I guess, yes, any church has the right to think what they want to in this country and to have, kind of discriminatory stances or dogma. But when it's tied to the way the church does business or does education or has certain rights, right, as an entity in this country, we are allowing, the Mormon church and other churches to have discriminatory status against protected identities that are protected classes of society, which is race, orientation, gender, right? With all the protected identities that we have in this country. So the church is able to remove itself. So yes, they can say, oh, sure, go ahead, we'll support this, but we don't really have to support it, because we can still discriminate on our own turf and still get federal funds. We don't have any consequence federally or monetarily to our discrimination status. So to me, that's what is maddening and upsetting. So if BYU wants to discriminate against a protected class of citizens, then why is the government sending monies to that university?
Exactly. So they are not a protected class of citizens.
Not under these religious freedom clauses, which again, is the language is very maddening, right? Religious freedom, that sounds very beautiful. We're all free to believe what we want. Sure, that is a beautiful idea. That's kind of an idea that the United States of America is based on. But when my beliefs then encroach on your ability to live your life in a successful kind of, equality type of way, and then on top of it, government monies are helping that happen, that's a little trickier in my book. So I don't know, Michelle, any thoughts from you on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when this all came out, and I had the same reaction everyone else did of initially, like, wow, this is amazing, look at what they're doing. And then you start to look more closely at why did they get so behind this. And I keep thinking about that conundrum that we have in life of, is there enough room for you to have your opinions, for me to have my opinions, and for both of those to be honored in a way where harm isn't being done? And I think this is like the ultimate dilemma here of like, okay, can we allow an institution to believe what it's going to believe religiously and conservatively? And can we do that in a way that doesn't harm LGBTQ plus folks, especially trans folks, in the topic that we just had? Like, is that possible? And I think so often we think, no, it's like one person has to win, as if it's kind of this like zero-sum game. And I wonder if we just haven't thought creatively enough of how to do this. Like, how do we respect religious freedom while also making sure that, those policies aren't causing people to self-harm or attempt suicide or, live very depressed lives. So, yeah, I mean, as hard as the conversation is, and as often as it feels like this extreme gridlock, I just wonder if we need to keep talking about it and start thinking a little more creatively.
Yeah. So it was, I don't want to undermine that it was a celebration. It was, I think, the passing of the bill was a celebration in general for the community, but I do think we have to look at the complicated factors that are part of this ongoing tension between religion and rights and politics, and how that shows up in our various states and in our various communities, depending on what churches, are kind of the majority in whatever state you're in. All right, moving on from there, we had a church cover-up made the national news that the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus on a beautiful painting done by Carlo Maratta, a 1650s painting called The Holy Night, was altered to basically cover her bust and shoulders. I guess the original painting had a bit of Mary's cleavage. Oh my, that's, I guess, really upsetting that a woman would have some breasts to breastfeed her child with. And they also, they removed the angels, and they also kind of lightened the countenance of the picture, right? So that there seemed to be more lightness and, dare I say, whiteness in the skin color and skin tone of both Jesus and Mary, and kind of the light that was emanating, the holy light, whatever. So I find this highly concerning on a lot of different levels. When I look at the picture now, it's interesting that, to me anyway, it went from the woman kind of looking like she's young, like maybe in 1920, to the woman now looking like she's 12, quite frankly. So I don't really understand what the purpose was there, but I think this speaks to the ongoing discomfort of femaleness, of female sexuality, of female bodies within the context of religious worship. Any thoughts on that? And of course, I don't know that I am super comfortable talking about the race issue, since we don't have a Black member of our team at this point, but I do think that there is also some concern there when, Western Christianity whitens all of the members of the Middle Eastern family, that was more than likely a brown family.
I think just the shame around women's bodies, it's not helpful to women when many already are struggling with how they feel in their body, about their body. There is already such a culture of shame over not having a very particular body. Not that being 12 necessarily is a culture's ideal, but nonetheless, it does create a sense to, for women when they see this, that there is something shameful in having breasts. And I think we've advanced further in terms of women not feeling ashamed to breastfeed. There is a little bit more acceptance of breastfeeding in public, but that's still, I have friends, I remember the days when you went into a bathroom stall to breastfeed because there was something so shameful about a woman, her breast, and breastfeeding a baby. So my biggest concern is that, well, it is an affront to the artist, to the art world. But what is the message that women are getting, about their bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've celebrated Mary for so long because, okay, here's the woman who raised Jesus, right? Who raised the Savior, and this idea of and did that through a woman's body, and through her breasts, is such a powerful message that she gave life to and sustained life through her body. And let's just cover that all up, right? Let's have the woman do the work, but then let's not see it. We don't want that to be seen. It's really unfortunate.
It's a continuation of, what's kind of typically called the Madonna whore complex, right? Where, I mean, really the whole story of Mary is very desexualized, right? So she's a virgin. She somehow is able to mother a child without the concept of sexuality being present. So it's this holy mother, this mother that's revered, and it's completely devoid and divorced from the sensual sexual aspect of child making, childbearing, and all of that. So it is kind of an interesting story to begin with that separates woman from her sexuality in the realm of motherhood. And I, as we work with many clients in the field of sex therapy, I find this being a common theme, that the archetype and role model of being a mother is somewhat uncomfortable with the archetypes and role models of being a sexual woman. How do we bring those kind of aspects that are so part of most females' identities together, instead of them having be compartmentalized and divorced in your psyche and in your body, because your body carries that as well. So this is a very deep-seated problem. This is kind of a silly way that you can see it being promoted in the at least in the LDS culture, but it's something that I think is at least Judeo-Christian. Well, I wouldn't even say Judeo, I'd say Christian-wide, that this divorce of sexuality from motherhood. All right, the last topic I wanted to bring up today. So this was an article that came out last summer. An article came out on CBN News, which is a kind of a religious news outlet, about easing the stigma of mental health problems in the church. And this is church wide, right? So when these articles talk about the church, they're mainly talking about the Christian church, which can be a lot of different congregations. They're kind of talking about these kind of themes that still seem to come up in a lot of congregations where, there's like a church tradition where people say, how are you doing? How is life going? And people are like, I'm blessed, I'm good, I'm happy, everything's fine, with this maybe overall pressure that if you are Christian or religious or worshiping, that in of itself should denote a happy life. And so therefore there isn't a lot of permission to be struggling. And if you are struggling, a lot of times that is either like outrightly, because I think some sermons actually will blame the person, or internally, it's been internalized that there must be something wrong with how I'm doing my faith, right? I must not be praying enough. I must not be righteous enough. I must not be a good enough person. I must not be a good enough parent. And that's why I must be struggling. And then the answer to trying to get better is to become more scrupulous in my religious practice, so I got to hustle even more to get the blessings from God. So this seems to be a church-wide problem that a lot of religious counselors and theologians are concerned about, because the growing number of those struggling with depression and anxiety in church communities, just like in general, and especially since COVID, is growing. So any thoughts about this and how it shows up and whether or not you've seen it in your own practices?
Oh my gosh, like every day. I feel like this is probably the thing. When I talk to clients, like in our consultation, when we're trying to figure out if we're a good fit, that's one of the first things I lead with is I am an emotions focused therapist. And that might sound funny because what therapist doesn't pay attention to emotions? But in reality, many actually take this very cognitive heavy approach and kind of say like, okay, we can kind of like wrangle your feelings into being like on just the list of positive, allowable emotions. And that's what I'm here for. And so I try to make it really clear to clients, like, all of your feelings are welcome here, and they all have helpful information, even the ones that are on that non-allowable list that society has told you shouldn't feel because they're bad. And so we're going to sit with things like sadness or frustration or resentment or anger, or even, like judgment that you feel towards other people, whatever it is, all these things that our church culture tells us we shouldn't feel and is like destructive to our society are actually things that we're going to have full permission to feel here. And so it's sad how we have these church communities where you go and it's baked into the title of like community. The idea is to find connection and belonging in this group. But how can you do that if you have a list of non-allowable emotions, all of which are deeply painful to you, and all of a sudden you can't express them to the people in your community? And so, the whole point, in my opinion, of being a part of a church community is to be able to say, I am suffering, I am struggling right now, and that's really, really hard for me. And for other people to see that and acknowledge it and be present with it is incredible. And so, I'm doing that constantly in therapy, where I'm just like, it's allowed, let's sink into this, let's feel the thing, is pretty life-changing for a lot of people. And it can be a really long process. Like, people will be like, I know I shouldn't be feeling this way, or I'm really ashamed that this is where I'm at today. And so constantly untangling that and saying, should you not be feeling that? Or can we actually say, yeah, you are. What does that mean about you and your life and what's happening? So I just think it's so crucial in mental health. Like one of the first things is feel your feelings, all of them. There is no list of unallowable and allowable emotions. They are all allowable, because if we can't feel the whole spectrum of emotions, then we're going to be disconnected from our lives and what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Stephanie, anything you'd want to say about this topic of mental health and stigmas and taboos with church people?
Yes. Well, just that I think it's important to separate between what is mental illness and getting professional help or mental health. I like to take more of a health approach. And what I think is sometimes taught to people is this is a spiritual illness. This is an illness. You're not feeling well due to spirituality. And often clergy are the frontline mental health people. They're the first people to see issues in mental health problems. And I do think in this situation, just having a lot more, if it's possible to have more training or be able to make more referrals out and understand the separation, the difference between what is a mental health issue and what is spiritual issue, and that they don't necessarily, the two are not necessarily the same. If that makes sense.
Yeah, right. They're usually not the same at all. They can exacerbate each other, right? And people have very little skills on knowing how to differentiate between the two. I know in this article, so Dr. Thema Bryant, she's the president-elect, I guess, for the APA. And she's a clinical psychologist, and she's also a ordained minister. So, sometimes there are people who kind of flank both fields. So she is basically saying that the church needs to create a culture where people can admit they're struggling and seek help. So this also kind of lies not only on people to educate themselves, the lay public, but for clergy leaders to be trauma informed, to be mental health informed, to have good resources and networking with mental health, people in their community, to even bring in training, bring in people to speak with their congregants around mental health issues. There's lots of things that clergy and ecclesiastical leaders can do to help with this taboo. So she says, I know my church tradition, when people say, how are you? The usual answer is blessed, or I'm blessed and highly favored. And so we want to get to a place where people can say, I'm blessed, and what is the rest of the story? What is the fuller story? What are they struggling with, and not seeing struggle as a personal weakness, right? Or a sign that they're sinning. That's, I think, where it's very dangerous, because then people hide and get isolated, and then those things can definitely become more exacerbating to things like depression and anxiety. So, okay. This has been the news with the Symmetry Solutions panel. If any of our listeners have a topic that they'd want to hear us address, make sure you contact me and let me know what kinds of things are maybe going on in your neck of the woods that we may not even be aware of. But if it has to do with the intersection of mental health or sexuality or faith or, relationships, family relationships, we are interested in having a discussion. So thank you all for being with me today, and have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon halls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland